Hello everyone, and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. Bill's declaration of war erupts like a thunderclap across the fragile, long-simmering battlefield between the Forresters and the Spencers, detonated in the single, unforgivable instant when Ridge's hand lashes out and strikes Katie, a moment so shocking, so brutally out of character and yet so devastatingly revealing, that it shatters any illusion that this rivalry could ever again be contained by words, boardrooms, or veiled threats. Because when Bill sees the mark on Katie's face, when he hears her trembling voice as she tries to minimize what happened, tries to protect the man who hurt her out of loyalty, habit, or exhaustion, something primal and incandescent ignites inside him, a fury born not only of love but of history, of years spent watching powerful men excuse their worst impulses, of watching Ridge Forrester walk through life believing that his name, his legacy, and his endless cycle of apologies grant him immunity from consequences. And Bill Spencer, a man who has built empires out of sheer will and unapologetic aggression, recognizes instantly that this is no longer about business, no longer about old grudges or competitive instincts, but about a line that once crossed can never be uncrossed, because violence against Katie is violence against everything Bill has sworn to protect, and as he storms through his office, slamming doors, barking orders, his mind races with memories of every time Ridge has humiliated him, undermined him, dismissed him as reckless or unworthy, and each memory stacks like dry timber feeding the inferno now roaring through his chest, because Ridge didn't just slap Katie in a moment of anger, he revealed a truth Bill has always suspected, that beneath the designer suits and tortured artist posturing lies a man who believes control is his right, who believes women are collateral damage in his endless emotional wars, and Bill will not allow that belief to go unanswered, so when he snarls, "You just made an enemy," it is not a metaphor, not a dramatic flourish, but a promise forged in steel, a vow that Ridge Forrester will learn what it means to face a man who no longer cares about optics, alliances, or restraint, because Bill's restraint died the second Katie was hurt, and as word spreads through Los Angeles, through fashion houses and media conglomerates alike, the shockwaves are immediate and electric, with whispers of a Forrester-Spencer war reigniting like a long-dormant volcano, executives nervously checking contracts, designers wondering which side they'll be forced to choose, and family members caught in the crossfire feeling the ground tremble beneath their feet, because Bill's anger is not the kind that burns out quickly, it is cold, calculated, and inexorable, a storm that gathers strength as it moves, and in private moments, when the shouting stops and the plans begin, Bill sits with Katie, his voice softer but no less resolute, telling her that what happened is not her fault, that love does not excuse violence, that loyalty does not require silence, and in those moments his resolve hardens further, because protecting her now means dismantling the power structure that allowed Ridge to believe he could get away with it, and Ridge, for his part, oscillates between remorse and defiance, insisting it was a momentary lapse, a terrible mistake, yet bristling at the idea that Bill would dare to judge him, to challenge him, to threaten the Forrester legacy, and this refusal to fully own his actions only fuels Bill's rage, because apologies without accountability are meaningless, and as the two titans circle each other, the air crackles with inevitability, every past betrayal resurfacing, every insult sharpened into a weapon, as Bill begins to move his pieces, leveraging media influence to expose truths long buried, targeting financial vulnerabilities with surgical precision, ensuring that every move Ridge makes is met with equal and opposite force, not out of petty revenge but out of a grim sense of justice, because Bill believes that power must answer to consequences, and if the system won't enforce them, he will, and the symbolism of it all is impossible to ignore, the slap that transformed rivalry into warfare, the moment that stripped away civility and revealed the raw, dangerous emotions beneath, as allies plead for de-escalation and family members beg for peace, but Bill remains unmoved, his mantra repeating in his mind like a war drum, no more restraint, no more excuses, because hurting Katie was the unforgivable sin, and in declaring war, Bill is not just defending the woman he loves, he is declaring that the era of unchecked entitlement is over, that men like Ridge can no longer hide behind charm and legacy, and as the battle lines are drawn and the city braces for impact, one truth becomes painfully clear to everyone watching. This is no longer a feud that can be settled with apologies or compromises, this is a reckoning, and Bill Spencer will not stop until Ridge Forrester pays the price for crossing a line that should never have been crossed. The reckoning does not arrive all at once, it unfurls slowly, relentlessly, like a shadow creeping across the city, because Bill Spencer does not rush vengeance, he engineers it, and in the days following the slap, the silence itself becomes terrifying, a silence so heavy that everyone connected to either family feels it pressing against their ribs, waiting for the moment it finally breaks, because Bill has gone quiet, and when Bill goes quiet, history has taught them that devastation follows. And Ridge Forrester senses it too, even as he paces through his home replaying the moment over and over in his mind, the flash of anger, the sound of skin on skin, the look in Katie's eyes that will haunt him far longer than any threat Bill could ever make, because it was not fear that stared back at him, but disappointment, and that disappointment gnaws at Ridge in ways he cannot easily dismiss, yet even now, even as guilt churns inside him, his pride claws back control, whispering that Bill is exploiting the situation, that this is just another power play in their endless chess match, and that belief becomes Ridge's shield, allowing him to frame himself as the victim of Bill's overreaction rather than the architect of his own downfall, while Bill, meanwhile, moves through his world with a terrifying clarity, calling in favors that have sat untouched for years, activating networks of influence that span media, finance, and politics, not with bluster but with precision, because this war will not be won with fists or shouting matches but with exposure, erosion, and pressure applied exactly where it hurts the most, and as he sits in a darkened office late one night, staring out over the city that bears his name in steel and glass, Bill reflects on how many times he has been painted as the villain, the brute, the reckless tycoon who bulldozes anything in his path, and he almost laughs at the irony, because now, when he is fighting for something that truly matters, when his rage is rooted not in ego but in love, he knows the world will still question his motives. Will still try to soften Ridge's actions, will still search for reasons to forgive a powerful man who crossed a line, and that knowledge steels him further, because he is done caring about how he is perceived, done playing the role others assign him, and if he must become the monster they fear to ensure Katie is never hurt again, then so be it, because monsters, at least, do not pretend to be saints. And the first tremor hits when a carefully timed exposé surfaces, dredging up old Forrester secrets, not fabricated lies but truths that were once buried under settlements and silence, truths that cast Ridge's impulsive slap not as an isolated incident but as part of a larger pattern of volatility and entitlement, and the media pounces, commentators dissecting Ridge's temperament, his history of emotional outbursts, his tendency to lash out when cornered, and while Ridge fumes at the invasion of his privacy, his anger only confirms the narrative Bill wants to cement, because every time Ridge reacts defensively, every time he blames others for his own behavior, the mask slips further, and Katie watches all of this unfold with a mixture of guilt and relief, because she never asked for a war, never wanted to be the catalyst for another chapter of destruction between two men she once cared for deeply, yet she cannot deny the strange, grounding sense of safety that comes from watching Bill stand so firmly in her corner, not demanding silence, not asking her to minimize her pain, but insisting that what happened matters, that she matters, and in quiet conversations away from the chaos, she begins to unpack years of emotional compromises she has made, years of excusing behavior she would never tolerate from anyone else, and as she does, her strength grows, her voice steadier, her resolve clearer, and this transformation frightens Ridge more than Bill's threats ever could, because he realizes that this time, he may actually lose her, not to Bill, but to herself, and that loss terrifies him, yet even fear cannot fully pierce his arrogance, because Ridge still believes he can fix this with time, with a grand gesture, with the right words delivered at the right moment, unaware that Bill has already ensured there will be no easy redemption arc waiting for him, because redemption without accountability is just another illusion, and the pressure escalates as investors begin to waver, their confidence shaken not only by the scandals but by Bill's strategic maneuvers in the market, moves that corner Forrester Creations into difficult positions, forcing Ridge to choose between protecting his company and protecting his pride, and each choice costs him something, relationships strained, alliances fractured, and as the walls close in, Ridge lashes out again, not physically this time, but verbally, publicly, his frustration spilling over in interviews that only deepen his image problem, while Bill remains conspicuously absent from the spotlight, letting Ridge unravel on his own, because Bill understands that sometimes the most effective weapon is patience, and as weeks turn into months, the war reshapes everyone involved, children caught between loyalties forced to confront uncomfortable truths about their parents, colleagues re-evaluating their admiration for Ridge, and Bill himself grappling with the consequences of his campaign, because even justified vengeance leaves scars, and there are nights when he wonders how far is too far, when the line between justice and obsession blurs, yet every time doubt creeps in, he remembers Katie's shaken voice, the mark on her skin, the way she flinched when someone raised their hand too quickly, and those memories cut through hesitation like a blade, reminding him why this fight matters, and the inevitable confrontation comes not in a boardroom or courtroom, but in a quiet, private space, when Ridge finally stands face to face with Bill, stripped of his bravado, his empire wobbling, his reputation tarnished, and for the first time, he truly understands that this war was never about dominance or rivalry, but about accountability, about consequences long overdue, and Bill does not gloat, does not raise his voice, because his power in that moment comes from restraint, from the certainty that he has already won the most important battle, the one for Katie's safety and self-worth. And when he tells Ridge that this is what happens when you mistake forgiveness for permission, his words land heavier than any punch ever could, and Ridge is left alone with the wreckage of his choices, forced to confront the reality that some lines, once crossed, cannot be erased, only answered for, and as the dust slowly settles, the city bears the scars of the conflict, alliances reshaped, power redistributed, but at the center of it all stands Katie, no longer defined by the men who fight over her, but by the strength she found when one of them finally refused to let her pain be dismissed, and Bill, watching her reclaim her life, knows that whatever the cost, whatever enemies he has made, the war was worth it, because this time, he did not fight for pride or power, but for love, and that, above all else, is a victory no one can take away. In the uneasy aftermath of that confrontation, when the echoes of Bill's final words still seem to vibrate through the walls and into Ridge's bones, life does not simply snap back into place, because wars of this magnitude leave residues that cling to everyone they touch, and the first thing Bill notices is how different the air feels when he walks into a room with Katie now, lighter in some ways, heavier in others, as if both of them are still learning how to breathe in a world where the truth has been dragged into the open and left there to dry, unvarnished and undeniable, and Katie, for her part, carries a new steadiness that surprises even herself, because although the pain of that slap has long faded from her skin, its impact has rippled outward, forcing her to examine not just Ridge's behavior but the pattern of her own endurance, the quiet tolerance she once mistook for strength, and as she begins to speak more openly, to name what she felt and why it mattered, she discovers that her voice no longer trembles when she does so, and this transformation reshapes her relationships in subtle but profound ways, because people who once assumed her silence meant consent now find themselves confronted with boundaries that are firm, calm, and non-negotiable, and Bill watches this evolution with a mixture of pride and humility, because he understands that while he fought the war, Katie fought the deeper battle within herself, the one that required her to reject the comfort of familiarity and step into a future that was not defined by appeasement, and yet even as he stands beside her, Bill cannot escape the consequences of his actions, because power wielded in anger, even righteous anger, does not vanish without a trace, and the enemies he has made do not simply retreat into obscurity, they regroup, whispering his name in boardrooms and back channels, painting him once again as the dangerous man who destabilizes everything he touches. And there are moments when Bill feels the old temptation rise, the urge to double down, to crush any lingering resistance with overwhelming force, but Katie's presence tempers him, reminding him that this chapter was never meant to be endless destruction, but a necessary reckoning, and as weeks pass, Ridge finds himself wandering through the ruins of his former certainty, haunted not only by the professional fallout but by the personal void left behind. Because the world no longer reflexively bends to his version of events, and the apologies he once relied on now ring hollow even to his own ears, forcing him to confront a truth he has spent years avoiding, that remorse without change is nothing more than self-indulgence, and this realization unsettles him deeply, stripping away the narrative he used to shield himself from accountability, while the Forrester empire, once so secure, enters a period of painful introspection, designers and executives alike questioning the culture that allowed volatility to be excused as passion. And though the company survives, it does so altered, chastened, its future no longer tethered solely to Ridge's charisma, and the wider world takes note, because scandals fade, but cultural shifts linger, and Bill's role in catalyzing that shift becomes a point of quiet debate, some hailing him as a necessary disruptor, others condemning him as an opportunist, and Bill accepts both judgments with surprising equanimity, because he has learned that being understood by everyone is a fool's goal, and in private moments, when the city sleeps and the noise dies down, he reflects on the cost of loving fiercely, of choosing to fight when walking away would have been easier, and he knows that despite everything he has lost, alliances, illusions, the comfort of moral simplicity, he would make the same choice again, because the image of Katie standing taller, freer, is worth every scar, and Katie herself, as she steps into this new phase of her life, begins to redefine what safety and partnership mean to her, no longer equating intensity with devotion, no longer mistaking conflict for connection, and as she and Bill navigate this recalibrated relationship, they do so with a caution born of hard-earned wisdom, understanding that love does not require war to prove its worth, and yet the shadow of the past remains, a reminder of how quickly lines can be crossed when power goes unchecked. And this awareness fuels Katie's growing commitment to speaking out, to supporting others who have been silenced by fear or loyalty, turning her pain into purpose, and in doing so, she ensures that what happened to her does not exist in isolation, but becomes part of a larger narrative about accountability and change, while Ridge, isolated by the consequences of his actions, faces a crossroads that will define the rest of his life, because he can either retreat further into bitterness, clinging to the belief that he was unfairly punished, or he can confront the uncomfortable work of transformation, and though the path forward is uncertain, the war with Bill has stripped away his illusions, leaving him no choice but to face himself without the buffer of excuses, and as the seasons turn and the city gradually moves on, the legacy of that single, shocking slap endures, not as gossip or scandal, but as a catalyst that forced powerful men and resilient women alike to reckon with the difference between love and control, passion and entitlement, and Bill Spencer, standing at the edge of his empire, finally understands that the greatest power he wielded was not his money or influence, but his refusal to let harm be normalized, his insistence that some acts demand consequences no matter who commits them. And in that understanding, he finds a rare and hard-won peace, knowing that while wars can reshape landscapes, it is the courage to draw a line, and defend it, that truly changes lives. Time has a way of revealing what survives after the noise fades, and as the months continue to roll forward, the true aftermath of the war becomes clearer in the quiet moments rather than the headlines, because while the city has largely moved on to fresher scandals and shinier dramas, the people at the center of this one are still living inside its consequences, still adjusting to the altered gravity of their lives, and Bill, who once thrived on conflict as if it were oxygen, finds himself confronting an unfamiliar stillness, a pause that forces him to reckon with who he is when there is no enemy left to fight, when the fire that drove him has cooled into embers, and at first that stillness unnerves him, because for a man like Bill, motion has always equaled purpose, yet slowly, almost imperceptibly, he begins to recognize that this quieter rhythm is not emptiness but space, space to listen, to reflect, to be present in ways he never allowed himself before, especially with Katie, whose growth continues to unfold in ways that are both inspiring and challenging, because she is no longer content to orbit someone else's intensity, no longer willing to subordinate her needs to preserve peace, and this recalibration reshapes their dynamic, requiring Bill to meet her not as a protector or avenger, but as an equal, a partner who respects her autonomy as fiercely as he once defended her safety, and there are moments of friction as they navigate this new terrain, moments when old habits resurface and sharp words threaten to reopen old wounds, yet unlike before, those moments do not spiral into destruction, because both of them have learned the cost of silence and the danger of unchecked emotion, and they choose, again and again, to pause, to speak honestly, to repair rather than rupture, and this choice, repeated over time, becomes the quiet miracle of their relationship, something built not on adrenaline or crisis but on mutual accountability, and elsewhere, the ripples continue to spread, as the industry that once normalized volatility under the guise of genius begins, however haltingly, to re-evaluate its standards, with conversations about boundaries and leadership emerging in spaces where they were once dismissed as weakness, and though change is uneven and often met with resistance, the fact that it is happening at all marks a shift that cannot be entirely undone, and Katie's role in these conversations grows as she steps into advocacy not as a symbol of victimhood but as a voice of lived experience, someone who understands the seductive pull of loyalty and the quiet erosion it can cause, and her willingness to speak candidly resonates with others who have long felt pressure to endure rather than confront, creating connections that extend beyond her personal story and into a broader movement towards self-respect and accountability. And Bill, watching her from the sidelines, grapples with a complex mix of pride and humility, because while he once believed his greatest contribution was the war he waged, he now understands that his most meaningful act was standing back and allowing Katie to step forward on her own terms, trusting her strength rather than overshadowing it with his own, and this realization softens something in him that had been hardened by years of combat, allowing him to imagine a future defined less by dominance and more by stewardship, less by conquest and more by care, while Ridge, still navigating the long road of consequences, exists in a state of uneasy limbo, neither fully redeemed nor entirely condemned, forced to live without the shortcuts that once smoothed his path, and this prolonged discomfort becomes, in its own way, a teacher, stripping away the reflex to blame others and leaving him face to face with the patterns he must either confront or repeat, and though his journey toward genuine change is slow and uncertain, the absence of easy forgiveness ensures that any transformation